Good evening and welcome to the inaugural York Consortium for Conservation and Craftsmanship webinar. We're delighted that over 180 people have registered to join us this evening, and we very much hope you will enjoy the presentations you are about to hear. My name is Alex McCallion. I am the Director of Works and Precinct at York Minster, and I'm a committee member of the YCCC. We've spent some considerable time rehearsing the choreography of the IT for this evening, so we're not expecting any glitches, but as this is our first broadcast, please do bear with us if there are any gremlins. All presentations have been pre-recorded to mitigate against internet dropout. During each of the presentations, you are invited to put questions to each of our speakers, and to do so, if you just hover your cursor over the bottom of your Zoom application, the Q&A tab will pop up. There will also be an opportunity at the end of the presentations to put questions to the panel. And if your question is intended for the panel, please just make a note at the beginning of your question to the panel. So that's the housekeeping over for this evening. And may I now introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Bethan Griffiths. Good evening, Bethan.
Good evening, everyone.
Our second speaker is Keith Barley. Good evening, Keith.
Good evening, everyone.
Our third speaker is Susie Clark. Good evening, Susie.
Hello, everyone.
And our final speaker is Matthias Garn. Good evening, Matthias.
Hello, good evening, everybody.
Before we begin our presentations, I'm delighted to introduce our president, Sir Ron Cook, who will give a short background to the consortium. Good evening, Ron.
Well, thanks, Alex. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this extraordinary, and I have to say very modern, substitute for our AGM. And I want to thank everyone who's made this webinar possible. Katie, the organisers and the speakers. Believe me, there's a huge amount of work goes into getting this show on the road. And I want to thank also, equally strongly, such a large number of you for joining in. It shows, I think, what an enduring and vigorous charity the YCCC has become. When we set out to create the consortium, our first aim was to bring together the unique number of highly skilled craftsmen and conservators in the city with the strong conservation expertise in the university. But having done that, we set out 4 ambitions. To make sure everyone got to know each other, very important. To try and make joint bids for contracts and heritage projects inside and outside York, to improve heritage skills training and CPD, and eventually to make York the national centre. And we did this in at least 5 ways. We created open days where everyone could show off their skills and projects. We created a directory of companies like this, which is now in its 5th edition and extremely successful. We created an annual lecture and an AGM in normal circumstances. We created an online presence, an annual report, a newsletter, now a webinar to keep people informed. And we created in 2001 the foundation to provide bursaries and awards. And I want to thank everybody for the massive fundraising efforts they put into this. And it's become now one of our major contributions. So today, the YCCC flourishes and continues to meet our initial aims. Most of the credit for all this goes to Martin Marsh and the initial committee and their successors who've worked tirelessly, and all of them deserve our sincere thanks. Which brings us to today's showcase. Hopefully, this small sample will remind us of the range and exceptional knowledge and skills we have here in York, and it'll reveal our continuing contribution to sustaining our physical and cultural heritage. Thank you, welcome once again, and back to you, Alex.
Thank you, Ron. Our first speaker this evening is Bethan Griffiths. Bethan is a director of the Ironwork studio and is a specialist designer and consultant in decorative architectural ironwork. Her passion for metalwork, especially blacksmithing, was developed while studying for her BA in 3-dimensional design. This has led to her being involved in a wide range of prominent projects, from a new contemporary bandstand at a World Heritage Site to the restoration of Grade 1 listed work. In giving something back to her craft, Bethan has been involved in many voluntary projects, Most recently, she is significantly involved with the development of guidelines, training, and accreditation for the restoration of heritage ironwork through her position as a trustee for the National Heritage Ironwork Group. Bethan.
Hello everyone, and thanks Alex for the introduction. As you've just heard, I'm an ironwork designer and consultant, not a paint specialist. However, today I am talking about paint, or rather the colour of it. My talk is Preconceptions about the colour of ironwork. The relevance of colour is because ironwork is routinely finished in some way, painting being the most common. It's a necessity that often can't be avoided. You know, it's needed to stop the rust. The title Preconceptions comes from my experience of the reaction I get every time I mention colour to a client. I can in fact almost guarantee the colour they give me. The purpose of this talk is therefore to challenge and explore where this autopilot reaction, or preconception as I prefer to call it, to choosing a colour for ironwork comes from. Where to start? Well, we live in a world of colour. You know, there's many and varied options, from bright and bold to subtle and calm. We're inundated with choice of colour when we buy things, from clothes to cars, paper, pens, everything in fact. You know, it's a choice we make every day of our lives. There's so many options, and this is particularly true when it comes to paint. You know, colour charts are aplenty. You know, we buy any sort of paint coating, we choose it from the colour chart. You know, even if it's white, we're inundated with choices. You know, so it's not just for emulsion, but for specialist paints, for ironwork as well, that we have all of this huge amount of choice. Our built environment as a result is full of colour, making optimal use of this wide and varied palette. In other words, colour is easily and widely available. But what colour do you think of when you think of ironwork? We live in a world of colour, yet black ironwork is everywhere. It may not be the only colour, but it is by far the most dominant one. Yes, black, that's the autopilot reaction I get every time I mention colour to a client. This is not just in the UK, but internationally. Why, to me, is the big question. Why is this? Why black? Why so popular? Why is it everywhere? Is it just a fashion? When it comes to ironwork, is it that people just don't think before they choose the colour? Is it simply that there is a preconception that ironwork is, was, and always should be black? Well, misconceptions. There are two common ones. The first myth is that black is the traditional colour for ironwork. But let's look at the word traditional. According to the dictionary, to be traditional, something has to be long established, conventional, customary even. So how long do you think people have been painting ironwork black? Any ideas? Would it surprise you if I told you only since the 1960s? It surprises a lot of people. Early ironwork was colourfully painted. Just look at these samples, be it medieval, Renaissance, 18th century, whatever. There are loads and loads of examples of coloured ironwork. Colour is not a modern invention. So, myth number 2 is that the grief-stricken Queen Victoria proclaimed "paint everything black" on the death of Albert in 1861. Well, in memory of Albert, the Albert Memorial was completed in 1872, and it was restored to its original colour scheme in 1998. Take a look. Note how the colour scheme works as a whole, be it the finial, the roof, the stonework, ironwork, or floor. There's not a hint of black anywhere. So the myth of paint everything black does not even apply in Victoria's lifetime. So we've covered the two most common myths, but there are other influences on colour. One of them is fashion. Here is the 1926 little black dress by Coco Chanel. It was a profound dress in its time. You can't imagine that now because everyone has a little black dress. But before Coco designed this dress, black was a colour for mourning only. It simply wasn't considered fancy enough to look good. This little dress influenced and changed perceptions towards black. This didn't, of course, directly influence the colour of ironwork, but it does illustrate how opinions and attitudes towards colours change. Seeing the past in black and white, this is another plausible influence on the culture of black. Is black and white, photographs, do they subliminally influence our thoughts of the past and traditional colours? Here we have an 1868 cast iron fountain designed and built by the Sun Foundry in Glasgow. It's the only one of its kind and stands an impressive 8 metres. Any ideas what colour this fountain was originally? Perhaps not what you're expecting. Here it is restored to its former glory in 2014. Built as a centrepiece to attract attention, I guess it shouldn't really be a surprise that it is full on colour. Exceptions to the rule of black. Well, of course, there has to be one. And for me, it's bridges that particularly stand out. They are very large structures and they're often quite colourful. But why colour in this situation? Well, there's no set reason, but for me, there's a few things to consider as to why they are. Design is one. This bridge is cast, and as you can see, there is design detail that is ideal for a multi-colour palette. So the design is there and suits going in colour. But secondly, there's branding. If you take Victorian railway bridges, they were branded in the company colours. Other things were too, like the Sheffield City Hall gates here. So that's quite a big influence when we see things kept in colour. Obviously think of heritage conservation. Simply conserving things to their original colour schemes. This is one way that items have been kept in colour, although it obviously isn't always the case. But then lastly, the sort of public perception. Obviously, with the prominent bridges, it simply just wouldn't go down well to have these huge decorative structures painted black. But anyhow, that's my theory to why some items are not always black. So here we have a great example. It's back to original colour scheme, and these are the Natural History Museum railings, originally built in 1881. As you can see, the colour of the ironwork is again part of the overall colour scheme for the building. Restored in 2017, we are fortunate to live at a time when much work is being restored to its former glory. So here I am back to where I started, black and colour. There's no reason why colour ironwork should not be black. I'm not saying that black should never be used. However, my point is to question it. Question the autopilot response of black. That, in my experience, happens on nearly every job when I first mention colour. For some of you, there may be nothing new in this presentation. However, I hope it has helped inspire you to help inform people who simply choose black for no other reason than being on autopilot. Reactions to reinstated colours. This last slide is really for the conservation professionals in the audience. It's because reactions vary significantly. This is Canada House in Trafalgar Square, London, built in 1820. The picture bottom left is the railing colour prior to restoration, showing a black top coat in 2011. It had a complete paint analysis done by the paint specialist Helen Hughes, And as a result, the railings were returned to a previous green colour scheme under the guidance of Historic England. The middle picture shows the finished result in 2012. Helen walked past just a few years later in 2016, only to discover that they had returned to black. So the amusing bit is that the owners went along with everything they had to do for planning. When all the approvals were gained and the conservation officers were out of the way, they simply got the paint pots out again and returned the railings to their preferred colour of, you've guessed it, black. From my point of view, I would love all ironwork to return to colour, but I realise that this is unlikely to happen and probably shouldn't happen, that all ironwork should be colour. However, this is not intended to dampen spirits, but rather to remind people that how strong that preference and preconception for black is. There's a lot of educating and explaining that needs to go on if a refurbished scheme is to be successful. So, as an ending note, if you're involved with one, good luck. The results will be amazing, but let's hope that everyone buys into that. I hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bethan. It'd be interesting when we redecorate Dean's Park railings next year to have a look to see what the colour of those railings was originally. So the first question this evening, what made you choose a career in ironwork?
Oh, I think it found me rather than me finding it. I always really enjoyed working with my hands. And I did a three-dimensional design degree, as you explained at the start, but there was something about metal and the fluidity of it, and I liked the function of it, that it was out there and you could use it. You know, gates are used every day as our balustrade, so it was a natural draw to me, that beauty and function.
Thank you. And the next question, what were the traditional colours of ironwork before the 20th century?
Right. That's a good question, and one was I didn't cover in my talk. So I'm going to simplify this because colour, obviously there's a lot of traditional colour history, but let's simplify it to exterior ironwork, and let's begin with the start of the golden age of ironwork at the very beginning of the 18th century, so the very turn of the 1700s. Grey was a very dominant colour then. As was blue. There were very strong associations with ironwork. The grey, because it was quite a simple coloured paint to make, and it also had a resemblance to the iron itself. And you might have remembered in one of the slides I showed you a blue staircase at Hampton Court, indigo blue. So other strong fashions came by. Some of it is a fashion, others were technical development. So you get invisible green towards the end of the 18th century. That's a very dark green. It's very great in the landscapes, you know, where you want things to disappear into the background. But come about 1820, chrome yellow as a pigment came in, and therefore it gave you the ability to create quite a bright green. So you get Brunswick green then. And by the time, if you remember the two slides that I showed you of the Albert Memorial and the Natural History Museum, so about that, by 1850s onwards, red lead was very popular. It's a very deep red and it's very brown. And so those are the dominant ones for exterior work. Interior's slightly different. If you are really keen on knowing about traditional colours, Patrick Beattie is your man, and he's got a book out called The Anatomy of Colour, which will give you all the colour history that you could dream of.
Thank you. And last question, how easy is it to train as a heritage ironworker? I presume it's quite a long apprenticeship.
It's not easy as heritage. As to get into blacksmithing is pretty straightforward because there are college courses for it. And they do deliver all the traditional skill sets. So you do have the skills of making traditional work, but there isn't a single course for heritage blacksmithing, which is a course that you can go on. You can do day courses or week-long things into conservation, but it isn't specifically set up for an apprentice getting in. So it's a case for people on the ground, they learn their skills in contemporary blacksmithing really, and then it's a case of whether they are wanting to use those skills in heritage.
Okay, thank you. We've got time for one last question that's just come in. How do you deal with clients' misconceptions about traditional colours and encouraging them to be a little more imaginative than black?
I basically explain the situation to them that some people say, but black's the easiest colour to make. Well, it isn't when you're talking about traditional lead-based paints, because you've got to have a huge amount of pigment in there. So when you explain to them that the problem with the level of pigment is that for exterior work, the paint just doesn't dry quick enough. And obviously there's lots of problems with that in an exterior environment. So obviously you can't handle it. And if the wind is blowing, as it usually is, particles are going into the paint. So a quick, dry and alkyd paint only was invented between the wars in the 30s, but it didn't become popular for use until the 60s. So, but if I explain the story to people, quite majority of people are interested, although it might take a bit of time to digest to move on from them. But other people, it's just, no, I just want black. So it's straightforward. It's each client is, you know, a separate one.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And we'll see you a little later for our panel discussion.
Thank you.
Our next speaker this evening is Keith Barley. Keith is the director and head conservator at the Barley studio. Keith is internationally renowned in stained glass conservation, especially for the environmental protection of vulnerable stained glass. He was awarded the MBE in 2015 for services to cultural restoration and conservation, in particular for his work at St Mary's Church in Furford, which also formed the subject of his MA by Research, which was awarded by the University of York in 2017. Keith is an ICON accredited conservator, a conservation advisor to the UK Corpus Vitriarum, a fellow of the British Society of Master Glass Painters, and the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. Keith was the Master of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass in 2018, one of the few practicing glaziers to be given this honour. In 2020, Keith received the Master Certificate Award given by the Worshipful Company of Glaziers. Keith.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This evening, I'm going to talk about the ethics of stained glass restoration. And I need really to begin with the history of stained glass. So following Henry VIII's disillusionment of the monastery and our period of iconoclasts smashing religious imagery, and the decline of stained glass, the period of Puritanism, the whole profession went into a massive decline. And our heritage of stained glass was left to fall in disrepair and decay. It wasn't until the 19th century, when there was tremendous wealth within our society, that ancient stained glass was receiving attention. New churches were being built, and importantly, medieval churches were being extended or restored. And they came across the problem of these relics of ancient stained glass in their windows, many of them severely destroyed. And one of their options were to gather all these fragments from the various windows and put them together as an arrangement, a jigsaw puzzles, all different types, into one window, one opening, with no care of where they were from or any of the history, just put in as a complete salad of arranged fragments. We now have to sort of look at a couple of examples that I've experienced and to understand why in the 19th century some of these practices received such criticism that the ethics that I started with at the beginning of my career over 50 years ago were very much in force. The slide in front of you is from Stamford-on-Avon Church in Northamptonshire. And believe it or not, the one on the left is a drawing and painting by a barrister called Charles Winston, who was instrumental in a great deal of research in the 19th century. He would go round and catalogue and draw selected pieces of stained glass throughout churches and cathedrals. And it was said of his drawings, there were as near facsimiles of the originals as could be achieved by watercolour on paper. And you can see here his drawing of the eagle, the evangelist symbol of St. John. And when I was commissioned to do the work on the 13 windows of the church, this was the condition of that particular panel. Winston could see what was going on in this period in the 19th century. And he said there's more to be feared by these well-meant but ill-judged restoration, more damage that can be done than all the iconoclasts put together. He made massive appeals to those in authority to actually control what was happening to the heritage of medieval stained glass in this country. And if we have a look at the next slide, this is what happened to those pieces. These plumbers and glaziers from Lutterworth came in and just willfully took out the eagle to use as stopgaps for the drapery of this bishop. And the blank face, just ordinary toilet cathedral glass, but they did scratch on the two eyes and the nose just to give a hint of what this expression of this bishop might have been. Of course, this sort of thing shouldn't have happened. So during our restoration, we removed those pieces, and you can see it is virtually back to how it was originally intended to be viewed. So Winston Gray made massive amounts of comments about the restoration, what was happening, in the hope that these ancient relics would be passed down to us untampered with. Here's another example. This is St. Mary's Church, Furford in Gloucestershire, and if anybody's interested in stained glass, this is the pilgrimage site. It contains all 28 windows dating from about 1503. And they're all a complete iconographically complete scheme. But in the 19th century, a local firm of Birmingham, Chance Brothers, were called in to actually restore 2 of the 4 lights of this window. And they were asked to restore the figures of St. Thaddeus and St. Matthaus. What they did and what they considered, that anything that was severely broken, severely corroded, needed to be removed and new painted replicas inserted. And you can see here on the right-hand side, the panel, a panel of the upper half of St. Matthaus that was discovered under a glazier's bench and is now on display in the V&A Museum. You can comprehend here how 50% of the original glass has been removed from these 2 lights. Now, this type of restoration, painting replicas, received extremely good press at the time, with appeals that all the windows, having suffered from whitewash within and erosion, may be restored to their pristine condition. Encouraged by this, and also citing the Great West Window, which had been damaged in a storm in 1703, the whole of the upper tier of the Great West Window was repainted with not one piece of original medieval glass, late medieval glass, left in situ. A visit from the British Archaeological Association to the church caused such an uproar that the ethics of conservation, that these ancient relics should be left untampered with, and no attempt at conservation, at restoration painting should be attempted, were set in place. And following repairs to the windows of the church resulted in just plank stippled glass being inserted where glass was missing. So here we had established and went right the way through the late 19th century, right the way into the 20th century, that these objects were to be treated as antiquities rather than works of art. A major milestone in changing these ethics was post-war at All Saints North Street Church here in York, where Dr. Peter Newton, working with the Minster glaziers, using antiquarian drawings by Johnson, reconstructed the 9 Orders of Angels window. They put the medieval glass that survived in its proper positions, but the remaining areas were just infilled with colored glass or plain glass, totally unpainted. It's fantastic for this time, but the halation through the blank glass is quite disturbing. But this was a major milestone in changing these ethics which we had been passed down. In 1977, I was asked to rearrange the remaining fragments from All Saints North Street. Now, what I have done here, as you can see, is at least set all these fragments the right way up. So anyone viewing these fragments can get an idea of what and where they might have been in a previous window. In 1981, I was called in to collect a case of 16th century stained glass from Kirk Sandal. I apologize for the slide at the top, but it's the only one that exists of it when it was originally in situ in Kirk Sandal. But you can see from the slide below, I did a jigsaw puzzle and discovered the remaining canopy heads, which I put above the 2 central figures. Figures of Saint Margaret there with the dragon. In the bottom row, you can see a complete tracery light containing Saint Christopher. So at least I'm trying to get back to how the original artist intended this stained glass to look, rather than being treated as an object of antiquity. In 1984, I was at Warnden Church in Worcestershire. And you can see here the figure of St. Peter looking rather attentive with his finger pointing up his neck. And when it was rearranged, the fragments could be set how they originally were, with St. Peter, in fact, pointing towards his symbol of the cross keys. So here I painted the remaining part of his nimbus and set it into a typical canopy design from this period of stained glass. Again, the secret was working in collaboration with an art historian, in this case, Dr. Peter Newton. I started at Stamford-on-Avon Church with Dr. Peter Newton, and then following his tragic death, I went to work with one of his students, Professor Richard Marks. At the beginning of this project, I was issued a stern letter from the Council for the Care of Churches expressing how this was the most important grant-aided job they've had since the war, and that I must adhere to their strict rules that no pieces should be right-sided. In other words, if the paint was on the outside, turned round so the paint's on the in. No pieces should be rearranged. Nothing should happen without the strict permission of the Council for Care of Churches and its committee. And that my future depended on sticking to these rules. However, having all 13 windows out on the bench, and again with the enthusiasm of Professor Marks, we set about one of the largest jigsaw puzzles I've ever done in my life. Every panel was dismantled, and what wasn't original to that panel was set aside on a tray until we actually found its correct position within the various windows and sections of stained glass in the church. One major milestone, I believe, was the painting of new heads and hands to restore the meaning of a panel. And you can see here the figure of Christ enthroned. When we took it to pieces, the head of an upper torso and the hand raised was lost. And there were various other heads within the stained glass scheme which had been lost. So at a meeting between English Heritage, who were working on behalf of the National Memorial Fund, I suggested the painting of new pieces. It was very quickly said, no way, we only fund conservation, not restoration. Ah, what if I fund the restoration and provide the new painted pieces? Ah, that is a decision for the client. Well, the client went, ooh, yes, please. So I went ahead to paint new painted pieces, and this really gave me great confidence, because you can see in between the leaded section on the left and the panel itself, our new painted head by Harry Harvey. But what was remarkable is that we had a phone call from Stamford Hall, where in their barn they discovered a box full of leaves with bits of stained glass, which they believe might be something to do with the church. And leaded up in a separate panel, being separated for over 200 years, was the original head to this figure. And our new painted piece is not dissimilar, and that gave me great confidence that we're doing a good job. So in fact, this particular head was never inserted, but the original could actually edge bond to the original lower torso. I'm now returning to Furford, and you can see here, this area here is completely new by Chance Brothers, with no medieval glass in it or late Renaissance glass in it whatsoever. However, the lower tier and the traceries needed some serious work. You can notice that the radiating rings that span this window all come from the heart of Christ. And if you set that out using geometry, the blue ring of angels should have gone and just intersected into the upper tier of tracery lights. I proposed to Professor Marks that we do this, and he said, what evidence do you have for that? Unfortunately, there was a piece of the blue glass with its original gross nibbled edges that could have only fitted into the cusp points of the upper tier of tracery lights. So we were granted permission to recreate that outer ring. We also went on to restore the lower lights, in the far left here, you know, the St. Peter at the gates and the heavenly Jerusalem. So there's a lot of, in the windows at Furford, a lot of restoration work has been done. And this was able to be done because the church themselves were funding it, even though it was overseen by English Heritage. Because they were paying for it, they set up the Friends of Furford Church. We could do what the church wanted, but it had its critics. One of the favourite parts of the restoration at Furford was the restoration of the two thieves and the head of Christ in the Great East window. They'd been infilled with blank stippled glass, and the whole message, the whole focus of the devotion had been lost. So to reinstate the head of Christ, the suffering, the penitent thief, and the grimacing of the impenitent thief was a major milestone, and I believe it's restoring not only the artistic value, but also the religious value to this window. I'm going to leave you with 4 demons from the North Nave Clerestory at Furford. There was only one demon missing, and we created a new demon, and one of them is amongst this 4. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you have some good questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Our first question this evening is from Ruth Adams. What advice would you give to a stained glass student with a serious intent to enter a career in stained glass conservation about the experience they need to gain first? Who should they approach for advice, and how can they access opportunities?
We are such a minority profession that it's quite difficult. However, students have got the opportunity of joining the MA course in stained glass and heritage management at the University of York. Other students, certainly the ones I have taken on, have actually come to studios on a work placement, often self-funded, and got into the profession that way. You know, when their heart's in it, you know it. The other opportunities are through the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass. We have 2 schemes of training within the workplace. One is called the Award for Excellence, where a student can spend 40 weeks of a year visiting various studios, maybe 10 to 12 weeks at various studios. And then we usually offer 2 what we call Ashton Hill Awards, which are for 10-week placements within particular studios. Occasionally, ICON gives bursaries for students to gain experience within the workplace. But, you know, I'd encourage anybody to, you know, just show your enthusiasm, research the right people, where to go, and just keep battling away until you get it.
Thank you, Keith. I'm afraid we've only got time for one more question, but how would you have handled the challenges at Stamford-on-Avon if you'd not had the benefit of Winston's wonderful watercolours? And that's from Sarah Brown.
Well, that's a very good question, Sarah. Obviously, Winston didn't draw every single panel. He was quite selective. They were extremely helpful, as were the drawings by the Reverend Joyce at Furford, which were also with the V&A. You know, he did it for his book, you know, absolutely tracings and then coloured them in of the windows. But certainly Winston's drawings are quite remarkable. But there was still a lot of glass which was misplaced. The 12 apostles that are now in the nave, sorry, in the choir aisles, you know, there was one part of the of an apostle in the east window and one in the nave, and they were just half demi-figures, so we restored them, and all 12 apostles are now reunited, and some of them are still in their original medieval leading from 1325. Absolutely stunning.
Thank you, Keith. Our next speaker this evening is Susie Clark. Susie is a paper and photographic conservator and consultant. She was previously the conservator for the BBC Holton Picture Library, and since 1990 she has been a freelance conservator working in this country and abroad for a range of institutions and private clients. In 1996, she was the recipient of the Museums and Galleries Commission's Award for Research and Innovation. More recently, she was also the conservator for the joint National Science and Media Museum and Getty Conservation Institute research project on the identification of photographs. Susie.
Hello everyone, and welcome to my studio. I'm going to talk today about what is a photograph and can it be conserved. There is a myth in conservation, particularly paper conservation, that photographs are difficult to treat. There's also a myth amongst some of the wider population that nothing can be done with a damaged photograph. I'd like to quote from a recent client. "Thank you again. I really thought I was going to have to discard it. Why does everyone say they cannot be repaired?" I hope to show you that these are just that, myths. Firstly, I want to give you a sense of what a photograph might be. We all have preconceptions, and the definition covers a broader spectrum than you might think. A photograph is an image produced by light, some would say with a camera too. The image has to be long-lasting. Indeed, ideally it is permanent. I'd like to show you some images now. Photography is said to date from 1839 with the introduction of processes by William Henry Fox Talbot, who you see here, and a Frenchman, Louis-Jacques Mondet Daguerre, and this is his process, the daguerreotype. This consists of a silver or silver mercury amalgam on a copper base. However, the earliest photographs were made by another Frenchman, Niepce, in the 1820s. Here is one of those photographs which I worked on as part of a research project between the National Science and Media Museum in Bradford and the Getty Conservation Institute in California. It is thought to have an image which was originally made from lavender oil and is on a pewter plate. Photographs can be made from many things. At a minimum, they have a support and an image-forming substance. Usually, the support is either paper, as you see here, glass, as in this case with a lantern slide, film, as in this case with a film negative, or metal, as you saw earlier with the daguerreotype. Black and white images were commonly made from silver. However, there were two other groups of processes known as alternative processes, and these had images which were not made from silver. These are mostly popular in the late 19th and early 20th century. One group of alternative processes used other metals or metal salts, not silver, to produce the final image. And this is a cyanotype where the image is made from iron salts. The other group used pigments to form the image, as in this case, a gum bichromate print. Sometimes other materials are present which play a supportive role, for example, protecting the paper surface or holding the image to the support. And this is a detail from a pigment print, and in the pigment processes, you find that there is more pigment and more binder in the dark areas. So where you have a very abrupt boundary between a dark area and a light area, you'll see prominent relief, as you can see here. In more recent times, multicolour images have been popular, mostly using dyes, but some using pigments. these are examples of the most common by far, which is the chromogenic process. And this was also used for negatives, and a derivation of it was used for slides. This is your common late 20th century process, which was used for snapshots, amongst other things. Since then, we've had a range of other print processes, not necessarily made by light themselves, and therefore not true photographs, but used for reproducing digital images. And this photograph was taken during a workshop that I went to in 2006 at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And this was a visit to an artist's studios, and it shows a inkjet print produced on a matzo biscuit. Traditional photographic processes are also still used, sometimes in an adapted form, for reproducing digital images. Many other materials come as part of the photographic package. Cases with ornate and protective contents, such as you see here. This is a wet collodion positive. Albums, these are Victorian albums, and then here a mid-20th century album, and then late 20th century albums. And then you also get wallets and boxes and so on. The photographs that come to me all have a past, and that past may include an interesting journey in addition to the original value of the photograph. But it may also include some deterioration. Sometimes the deterioration stems from the components of the photograph itself, and this is often exacerbated by a poor environment. And a poor environment may be one which is too hot, too damp, too dry, too light, or contain chemical contaminants. Other times, photographs will have been subject to damage purely from an external cause, in other words, accidental damage. I'm just going to show you some examples of some of the typical things that might happen. And this first group show examples of chemical deterioration, as I say, probably exacerbated by a poor environment. So this is glass deterioration in the cover glass of a daguerreotype. This is glass deterioration. You can see where it's frosted, and this is a gelatin glass plate negative. This shows you silver image deterioration in an albumen print, probably primarily oxidation of the silver. And so you get this form of spots in this particular group of processes, silver processes, which are known as redox spots. And you also get fading out in the highlights, as you can see in the face and the lighter areas. Here you have an example of poor processing on the part of the photographer. So you've got silver halide still continuing to darken and form silver in the sky area of the print. Here you've got a chromogenic print, which you can see has faded considerably, and the dyes have faded in different proportions. So that gives it this slightly peculiar hue. And here you have a negative, film negative from the 1950s. Sadly, quite a typical problem in the 1950s with film negatives. The second group show examples of biological deterioration. So here we've got an example of mold. Here we've got an example of silverfish deterioration. And here we've got woodworm damage in the backing board, and you can see where I've removed it, the dust is sitting on the back of the mount. And here we've got mouse damage to some film negatives and enclosures. The third group are examples of physical damage to a photograph and associated materials. So this is really accidental damage. So here we've got a broken glass negative. And here we've got a cracked print and mount. The fourth group show damage which is caused by poor storage materials and methods. So this is an enclosure which has been taped over with a tape like pressure sensitive tape like sellotape, and the bag has been pulled back, and you can see underneath where the tape has been, the adhesive has emitted a gas which has then reacted with the silver in the emulsion, and you can see that underneath. This is a typical example of the original supplier's boxes that the unexposed glass negative plates came in. The photographers often used them afterwards for storing the negatives, and they were very poor quality and tend to disintegrate, as you can see here. Here we've got some 19th century albums which have been put in a cardboard box, and obviously to access these they suffer physical damage. You can see they're getting damaged at the edges and at the spine, and they're awkward to handle in this way. Here we have framed prints on a top shelf of a set of shelves. The shelves aren't very robust. You can see they're all leaning at a rather unsafe angle. There is inadequate protection and cushioning between them, so they're quite susceptible to damage. The work of a conservator can include surveying at collection level and advising about the surrounding environment and materials. This advice can also be given for individual photographs as well as at collection level, as is the case, for example, with private clients with a family photograph. Much of the studio work of a conservator will be removing poor materials around the photograph where appropriate, cleaning the photograph and surrounding integral materials, repairing physical damage, and introducing sympathetic materials which may not actually be visible but will help the photograph to survive better. So I'd like to show you now two examples of studio conservation, which are sort of at two extremes, really. This is a Crystolium, which is a photograph that was produced around the turn of the century, around 1900. It basically consists of a print which has been stuck to the back of a piece of thin domed glass. It was then sandpapered from behind. Various chemicals that could be applied to make it translucent, and then colour was applied with paint from behind. It was supposed to give you a sort of superficial effect of a 3D colour image. Now obviously you can see here it suffered accidental damage and it's got broken. So this is before conservation. This is during conservation. Lots of splints, tape splints have been put into place to hold everything in position. Unfortunately, it was missing 3 pieces of glass in the center of the image. The pieces of white paper show you which, or showed me which joins had been repaired at that stage. Then this is when the gluing was finished. And then this is when the Crystolium is back together. It was a very tricky process to do that one because it was so badly broken and you're working with domed glass. But nevertheless, it was an important family photograph and it was considered worth repairing. It was part of a pair. The next one is a much more sort of run-of-the-mill type of conservation job. This was a photograph which had some surface dirt. This is quite a sort of standard problem. And then here, I think you can see there's a line down here. I've cleaned it on the right-hand side, but I haven't cleaned it on the left-hand side. One wouldn't normally clean a photograph a half at a time, but this is to show you what the sort of difference is. So you can see it's much cleaner on the right. And then this is when it's been completely cleaned. So that's a fairly standard job and does not take a lot of time, relatively speaking. If a photograph needs studio conservation, there is also no point in putting it back into poor conditions afterwards. Getting the environment and storage and display conditions right is something that can really make a big difference. So that's also a part of what I do, making sure that everything is housed and returned, if it's come to me for studio conservation, in the right way. So here I've taken the lid off a box of rehoused glass negatives. They're all in conservation paper sleeves, which won't cause them any harm. And there are conservation materials used as dividers, as some inert cushioning as well, used as a divider. And they're reasonably supported in the box and reasonably resistant to getting broken. And then here we have a photograph of a new store, and the shelving is steel with appropriate inert finish, and it's strong enough for what it's being asked to do. All the photographs have been rehoused in conservation enclosures and conservation boxes. So this is an example within an institution of how it should be done. So I wanted to end on a positive note, so I hope that's suitably uplifting. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Susie. Our first question this evening, which is a very good one, I have some archive books and music manuscripts with mould. I've managed to separate the pages and wonder whether there is any fluid or other approach that can be used to deactivate the mould spores. And would an acetone bath be useful? And that's from Jonathan Louth.
Well, I think your acetone bath might knock you out before it actually killed the mould. So I wouldn't recommend that on health and safety grounds. There has been some use of alcohol at a more purified level than you would come across it for treating mould within paper conservation, though professionally. But it doesn't work perfectly. So there isn't a very good way of treating mould, certainly not as an amateur, unfortunately. It's more a question of keeping it in dry conditions so that it doesn't get any worse, really.
Thank you. And our next question from Sue, which leads on, which chemicals do you select for cleaning photographs?
Oh, it depends very much what the problem is. So it could range from using deionized water to a variety of organic solvents. Obviously, then you're using a fume cupboard, but it just depends what the problem is, whether it's just surface dirt, which is fairly superficial, or whether it's something which has stained the paper itself or stained the photograph. So it depends on the circumstances. There isn't one particular chemical.
Okay, thank you. And the next question from Lisa McIntyre, what is the method used for cleaning a photograph? And when is a decision made to clean a photograph, i.e. how dirty does it need to be to risk cleaning it rather than living with the dirtiness?
It depends what the cause of the dirt is. With silver images as well, cleaning can be a bit tricky because certain things can react with the image silver. You can actually make something worse if you turn if your cleaning material is a solution, particularly with water. You can make it easier for the solution to react with the silver and clean some of the elements that are already present in the print as dirt or photograph as dirt. So it's a bit of a tricky one, that I mean, there is no set way of treating a photograph. So, and it does depend, but it's more tricky for silver photographs. And for some colour images, the pH of the cleaning material is also critical because you can change the appearance of the dyes. So there's a whole host of things really that you have to take into consideration, really. So I can't give you a very specific answer, I'm afraid.
No, that's a very good answer, thank you. And our last question, do you ever get situations where you have to decide whether to sacrifice part of a photograph to protect the whole? And that's from Tim.
That's a nasty question. Yes, very, I suppose, yeah, I can think of one instance where I had to do that actually, which was very poignant, when it was just 2 colour snapshots which were stuck face to face, and it was, they were late 20th century. To most people they'd have been nothing special, but one of them showed the only photograph of somebody's sister who died when she was 8 years old, and they were desperate to have this photograph uncovered. And the other photograph was just a picture of pebbles on a beach. And normally, from the point of view of ethics and conservation, one would never destroy anything to take to to save something else. But in that situation, I mean, I separated them very carefully, but and I spent a lot more time on it actually than I charged for in that instance. But I felt that morally it was the right thing to do in that situation. But normally speaking, one sort of backs off altogether if you feel you're going to damage something. But if you really can't see a photograph at all, then you have to examine the case by case very, very carefully. But it's something we would do as an absolute last resort.
You must have felt under enormous pressure with that commission.
Yes, I did actually, because gelatin, which the emulsion is in those particular processes, when it gets damp, it blocks together, which is what had happened in this case. And it's normally in conservation, you try and humidify something to separate it. If you do that with something with a gelatin emulsion, it blocks further together. So I had to do it dry with a scalpel. So it was a very, it was a very precarious thing to do. So I did it very, very, very carefully. So.
Thank you, Susie. So our last speaker this evening is Matthias Garn. Matthias has worked in the stone industry for 30 years. Following his apprenticeship in Dresden, he worked in a number of stonemasonry and carving workshops in Europe before moving to England in 1998, where he worked for Wells Cathedral stonemasons and then for Dick Reed's workshop in York. Matthias runs his own stone business, specialising in the conservation and repair of historic stone structures. He is a German master in stonemasonry and stone carving, a member of the Worshipful Company of Masons, a freeman of the City of London, a SPAB Fellow, and a member of the Historic England Conservation Committee. He is a frequent lecturer, teacher, and advisor in the field of historic stone conservation. Matthias.
Good evening. Thanks, Alex, for the introduction. We have these romantic ideas of ruins without any lime washes or render on them. But remember, ruins are ruined buildings. They are crumbled stone missing their skin. I'm going to speak to you tonight about stone buildings that are used today, not ruins, but the same modern aesthetic applies to the care of these buildings. Unfortunately, a lot of our buildings were stripped historically to achieve this ruined look. And there is now this misconception or the myth that stone buildings always looked as they do look now, with the stones exposed to the elements. Buildings were historically rendered and lime washed in order to keep the water out, to keep them waterproof, draft proof, aesthetic reasons, and insect proof, for example. A lot of these churches I walk on would have had this protective layer of lime wash at some point, which would have been applied annually. This lime wash is now missing after 150 years of a fashion for exposed buildings. Combined with this was the pollution caused by the Industrial Revolution which accelerated the decay of these buildings that are missing their skin or their raincoat. We are now left with the devastating erosion of stones on these buildings we see now. I can tell you there's a lot of these buildings would not be standing today if they did not have a protective coat like a lime wash or a render or shelter coat on them. Before the fashion took hold, and the evidence of this is still here. Please sit back and I will take you on a brief visual tour explaining my argument, starting with some examples right now. In 2008, the west door of York Minster been lit by a French artist to show us how the medieval eye would have seen this west door based on evidence found on the west door. Inside, you can see still the remnants of paint, like here you can see red on the flowers. On this capital, you can see even gold. And you can see it all over when you go really close to the building. Of course, on high-end buildings like Lincoln Cathedral, you can see the pigmentation and remnants of blue, green, red, as you can see here. There is this very garish color scheme in Durham, still on a tomb, and it looks to us quite unfashionable and maybe a bit over the top. But this how this building's been intended, inside and outside. In Bethan, you have this lovely label stop, still with the pigmentation in place. In New York, they did in 1980s this medieval carvings on St. John's the Divine, still ongoing project to build this cathedral, and the color scheme being left to a very small little band of these figures you can see here. And again, maybe a little bit over the top to our eye, to our fashion today. The lips may be a bit garish again. We are very lucky having Pickering very close by, one of the finest interior wall paintings, medieval wall paintings you can find in the country. But when you look very close, the lower aisle is completely stripped. There's just ashlars, really random ashlars. The columns are bare and the arches. And I'm pretty much convinced the whole church would have been very colorful in and out. Otherwise, I don't think we would have found the church in this condition as it is at the moment. I put this slide in to show you just underneath the render, the rusticated render in Florence here, where the render failed, the brickwork, and you can score the render and make it like stonework, and that's very often done in order to save money. Very inappropriate cement pointing on the tower. That's why I just put it closed up on there. Brings me to external renders being even further treated. Sgraffito is like a layered technique where you have different colored renders put on top of each other and then scratched out, and then you have nice ornament, and sometimes also three-dimensional. In Dresden, after 1945, the castle been rebuilt based on old photographs, and old graffiti technique being used to cover up all of the bombshelled walls, really rough walls, and quite easy to cover up. Coming back to England, down south, there is a bigger appetite for rendering buildings, very often the towers, by the more exposed to the wind, a bit taller. And here in Singleton, you can see render being drawn out from the coins on the corners. And also you can see here on the southwest corner, very wet corner always on towers, where the string course is very wet. But the water doesn't go inside, it runs down on the render. So the core of this tower is pretty much protected from water ingress. Very short, my friend Stafford Holmes allowed me to put this picture in, and I advertise his book. So when anybody be interested a little bit more about lime, building with lime, a practical introduction, Stafford Holmes and Michael Wingate explain it into absolute technical detail. But what I wanted to show you here is it comes from the quarry, goes in a kiln, get burned, and we have quicklime. And the quicklime is the product what most medieval mason used for their render, their mortars, and most likely for their lime washes. Here you can see a mixing of a hot mix in our workshop. It's literally wet sand with quicklime mixed together, and you can reach up to 300 degrees. We have here something 134 degrees at the moment. And all of these mixes are very different, specific to every building. So historic mortars we create also in our workshop, but you have to find different sands and additives like porcelains or milk powder or eggs. There is loads of different recipes, but this would go too far in this lecture. I'm quite happy to accept another lecture, maybe talking about lime mortars and mixes. What brings me to the pigmentation. So when you have like the mixes ready, then you could add earth pigments in order to match either your stone, or you can color your building. So you can go from blue, red to sienna brown, burnt sienna. And with our limestone, Tadcaster limestone, we try to color in order to patch up. So this, you don't see our mortar repairs, our small rendered pieces with some shelter coat. Shelter coat is literally using quicklime and stone dust. There you see how we added to how we put it onto the building with smooth toothbrushes or smaller brushes, large brushes, and the idea of a very fine lime wash, like in the interior of a building, is when you have some erosion from salt pollution or from any other candles, then you could fill these micro cracks, as you can see here, with lime and with a lime wash, and it will carbonate and literally stabilize the surface, and the stone becomes hard again. As you can see on this side, there's some mortar repair. St. Wilfrid's Church in Kilvington, lovely little church, been wrong rendered, most likely in the 50s, 60s, with a cement render. As you can see here, all the water sat behind it when it rained. All the render been hacked off by the main contractor, and we provided all of the masoned elements to the church. And in the end, the east end was only shelter coated, and the rest of the church being left bare to show the ashlar walls, what in my eyes never would have been exposed. They should have been rendered again. Time will show. 10 years ago, we had a small project where we had to rebuild parts of this bay window in the King's Manor, and we shelter coated the entire limestone and did mortar repairs, lime washed the inside. Very successful project, but in my eyes, the entire King's Manor should be lime washed, and probably been always lime washed since Henry VIII moved in, and been probably very colorful, as we've seen early on, and probably been lime washed over centuries. Otherwise, we wouldn't seen the building as it stand there now. The erosion would have took place far quicker. Prime clients much more keen on protecting their buildings. And for instance, this arch, we cleaned off all the organic growth, lichens and moss, repointed it in lime mortar, and put a very light lime wash on it and a shelter coat on top. The antiseptic properties of the quicklime prevents any organic growth growing back very quickly, but you have to also trim back also trees and branches in order to protect your properties. Another very interesting project was the 3 tracery windows in St. Denis we done just recently, and we've been asked to repair them in the whole north side. So we took all the windows out. The outside was completely smeared in cement and completely eroded, completely gone. Probably 600, 700-year-old tracery. The inside perfectly preserved underneath 12, 15 layers of lime wash again, like the day it's been put in. And so we kept the layers of lime wash, analyzed them, many color schemes, and put the inside stones all back, and the outside stones we haven't replaced. We lime washed and shelter coated, and also the windowsills in order to make it aesthetic more pleasing. And also the inside is wonderful lime washed, as you can see here. The congregation is, I think, in the moment thinking of lime washing the whole north aisle, but not even the whole church. But with the funding is always a problem. Brings me to Tick Hill. Very similar, the tracery windows down there, you can see it's not all replacement, it's mortar repaired and shelter coat. What I wanted to talk about it is up here, you can see there's some medieval sculptures on the tower, which been very badly eroded and treated in the Victorian time with cement mortars. We removed cement mortars and all bird nesting, repaired them, used nano-lime, man-made lime, and shelter coats and lime mortars. There you see the nano-lime. I can answer some questions later, or maybe in another lecture I have to go talk about nano-lime. Nano-lime is man-made lime in alcohol. You can see here the figures, all the ledges on top being treated with mortar, so that the water can run off, and then shelter coated, and you can see here the result. But the value of these figures seems like higher than the entire tomb or the masonry on the building. In my opinion, the whole tower should be lime washed. Very controversial idea, but I do think these towers would have been lime washed, so you can see them from very far. Every Easter, the whole congregation would gather and do this. Little church up in the north of Germany, Rügen, St. Catherine's Church. A leaflet in the church explained the church was always rendered, but clearly the aesthetic today want to show us all the boulders being chopped in half and used as an infill between the bricks. York, St. Andrews, there is lovely evidence of lime wash, many lime washes there in the middle. I counted probably 12 to 15 lime washes. That's the leftover ashlars on the bottom of the medieval church. So there is evidence all over when you look for it. My last case study is Asquith, where we've been involved in repointing quite heavily the clerestory walls in lime mortar, and find a lot of remnants of lime render and lime washes on the really rough caused stones, and we try to convince to render the whole cluster wall, but we just pointed it why all stone buildings, they are being not rendered. At the moment, the architect is looking into it with us to come up with a proposal to re-render the entire tower. As you can see here, historic render is all over and then smeared cement around it. I hope you enjoy this, and next time when you travel around and you see anywhere some lime render or lime washes left on churches, you will be maybe looking at in a different way as you maybe did from tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthias. First question this evening, are lime mortar recipes regional?
Good question, very good question. I would say yes. Well, you probably have regional different pigments and also probably other products what you could use in the mix. So yes, I would say so. And also when you think regional, probably on the west coast in Scotland, you would use a different mix with maybe 4,000 millimeters of rainfall than maybe in East Yorkshire, they have probably just 700 millimeters a year of rainfall. So the recipe's been probably adapted to the use of the mortar.
Thank you.
I hope this answers the question.
Our next question is from Tim Meek. Ruskin famously said the true colours of architecture are those of natural stone in the stones of Venice. How far would you agree that Ruskin and the SPAB are part of the problem?
It's a very good question and probably very hard to answer in this forum, but I try my best. I would say the SPAB probably taking some part of it, or Ruskin wrote the ideas, William Morris took the ideas, but what I'm talking about it is literally to protect a building. And so, yes, the bare stones of Venice look beautiful in one or the other way, but what I'm talking more about, all of this building's been probably for a very long time protected with layers of lime wash, or I mean, you can call it a paint. And yeah, it's hard to answer really, I have to say. I think the SPAB have probably a lot of things to answer for, but I'm an SPAB fellow, and as an SPAB fellow I have two hats. I can be like the master mason and do a restoring job, and also an SPAB fellow being very conservative.
Thank you. I'm just very conscious of time, Matthias, so I'd like to bring the rest of the panel in for the panel questions. And just whilst the rest of the panel are coming in, one last question, and this is from Janice. To Matthias, how do you prove to conservation officers that the building was lime washed, or that a shelter coat should be used for protection?
It is very hard when, very similar to Bethan's railings, when you find some evidence, remnants, it's very easy to prove it. And very often on buildings, it is quite hard to do so, especially when the outside been weathered for sometimes 100 years, sometimes in small corners under the eaves or so you can find it, but it is very hard to prove. But my argument is stone erosion take place probably 150 years, stone erodes, and like the Minster, 600-year-old doorway wouldn't be there when it wouldn't be lime washed. It would have been gone 450 years. So literally the last 150 years where we didn't lime wash it. So the proof is sometimes the building itself.
Thank you, Matthias. Okay, so this question is to our panel. What has the impact of COVID-19 been on your part of the sector, and what do you see the way forward as being? Who would like to take that question? Keith, thank you.
Yeah, we are in very difficult times, and you know, it's my belief that the greatest things we're going to face are funding. You know, our churches and our private fundraisers can't have their raffles and their tombolas and selling cakes. A lot of the charities, their main funding is not making money to hand out. So I fear that there will be a shortage. However, there's a great deal of people willing and wanting heritage projects to continue, but I feel we may have a stalling process. And there's a lot of other businesses that are going to suffer as a result of this, and we may find a shortage of materials and other services. We're finding a hard job to find PPE at the moment, but I'm sure at the end of it, we'll get through.
Yeah, it's interesting that some of the government grants that are out there are so small, really, a lot of them wouldn't scratch the surface of some of the big projects that we're all responsible for. So this question is from James. How do you find the level of knowledge of local conservation officers, and how is your relationship with them? Who would like to take that question?
I can say something. I think conservation officers, they're just individual people, so their level of knowledge is as that. Some will be new in the job, some will be many years and very experienced. So the levels of knowledge are just going to vary significantly. And then sometimes you do come across ones where you have different opinions, but the thing is that I found in my experience, most people are prepared to listen to another side of the story. It isn't particularly black and white. They are willing to be informed. The biggest challenge I had was about colour. The conservation officer, Shrewsbury Cathedral, the front entrance was redone. I did all the ironwork and it was in blue. And the conservation officer walked past and had a major shock, but she'd just never, it was never on the paperwork put forward by the architect that had submitted. And she just didn't expect it to be anything but black, but was very accommodating, you know, when you can give reference and give story to it.
Thank you very much, Bethan. I'm just conscious that that we are coming to the end of this evening's presentation. So we hope you've enjoyed the presentations this evening, and to thank you for supporting our first webinar in such great numbers. I'm sorry that we've only had time for a selection of questions. But I think this evening has reminded us again, and through our own bursary scheme, the very real need for support networks such as the YCCC to those involved in the conservation of our built and artistic heritage. If you are interested in joining the YCCC, details are available on our website. I'm pleased to arrange, we've arranged a programme of 3 talks over the summer. Bethan Griffiths will give the first of our summer series of Second Tuesday talks on Tuesday the 14th of July at 7 p.m, and registration on our website has now opened, and you'll be able to find out more details of the series there. And finally, you'll be prompted to fill out a feedback form just before you log off this evening, and we'd be enormously grateful if you could fill this out. It will only take 3 minutes. So on behalf of the committee, best wishes to you all, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Goodbye.